everyone. I streamed a little bit yesterday, but the audio was shit, and I think it's because I just was not talking directly to the mic. So hopefully this is better. We're gonna watch some Tulsi Gabbard again. Hopefully I can flesh out what I wanted to say about this, because I've given this some thought. This is Tulsi Gabbard on Shawn Ryan.
They have done for years all that they could to destroy me. We don't want our boss to be infected with your boss's toxicity.
Are you serious?
I'm dead serious.
Where are these agendas stemming from?
A big factor is the insider trading that goes on. In some cases, they make direct threats, but ultimately, what does it come down to? It comes down to power. And the ends justify the means because they believe they alone know what is best for us, and they really do, at their heart of hearts, hate this country and what it stands for.
You're talking about taking God out of everything.
Yeah.
Where are these agendas stemming from?
At its core, it comes from people who ultimately want to be God. They want to be the ultimate master. They want to be the ultimate creator. They want to be the controller of all that they, survey.
Mm-hmm.
And
this is what Friedrich Nietzsche warned about 100 years ago. When you take God, or more accurately, the idea of a transcendent power, a higher power. When you take that out of the equation, you move that from society, that impulse in the human psychology is still there. I think humans have a natural tendency to gravitate toward a higher power regarding who created the universe. But when you take, in a secular society, that impulse for the transcendent moves to us, and we start thinking of ourselves as God. That's what Friedrich Nietzsche was talking about when he said, God is dead. I don't think he said that gleefully. I think he said that mournfully. And when you have a vast bureaucracy of governing a secular country, a bureaucracy filled with people who have a sense of self-righteous altruism, believing that they know what's best for others, that's a very dangerous environment where people call themselves leaders.
And so when you look at, for example, people who have faith in God, well, if you have faith in God, that means you are not going to be open to having faith in them or their power or the government. And so therefore, they view this as a competition, that they have to compete for our faith and our allegiance and our loyalty. And that if we believe in an authority and higher power that is more powerful than the government, then that takes away what they view as their oxygen.
Wow. How many of these people are there?
I can't give you a number, but when you look at people who are telling us that what we know to be objectively true in the biological difference between a man and a woman and a boy and a girl, and they tell us you're wrong, just believe what we are telling you, that a biological male can become pregnant. whether they realize, there are definitely politicians out there who are just parroting the talking points because they're lazy and they're just trying to go along to get along, and they're just trying to keep their job, and they care more about keeping the job than actually speaking the truth. And it's what we talked about. You don't want to be ostracized in Washington. You don't want to be cast out. They see what happens to people like me and what the Democratic Party did to me, even as I was in Congress and I was running for president on the Democratic ticket. They have done for years all that they could to destroy me. And I had, even when I was in Congress there towards the end, I was going to work with a Democrat colleague on a piece of legislation or an issue that we had agreed on for years and we had worked together on previously. And that member's staff told my staff, no, we're not going to work with you guys on this because we don't want our boss to be infected with your boss's toxicity.
And this is why I always say now that I always say the Democrats are filled with stupid people. Republicans are filled with crazy people. Republicans are crazy. Democrats are stupid because they don't pick strong candidates. They pick weak candidates who toe the line. They just stick to the talking points. If the Democratic Party had picked Bernie Sanders as their nominee in 2016, he would have won. He would have beat Trump. If they would have picked Tulsi Gabbard in 2020, she would have won. She would have beat Trump. Because people like those people. People like Bernie Sanders. People like Tulsi Gabbard. Because they're reasonable and real liberals.
Are you serious?
I'm dead serious. It's a true story. And so they look at people like me, even people who may agree on some of these things that we're talking about, that just, again, it's common sense. It's common sense. They are terrified. So we said not a single Democrat in the House or Senate has stood up for the well-being of kids in this issue of gender-affirming care. Not a single one, again, that I've seen and I've looked, not a single one has stood up against President Biden's mandate that has destroyed Title IX, which creates a fair and level playing field for girls and women's in education and sports. He destroyed that by inserting gender identity, which then opens the door wide open for any man to go in, as we've seen with Leah Thomas and these other examples, to go in and compete, a biological male to compete in biological women's sports. Not a...
The whole gender politics thing, the transsexual issues, all that shit, I think that's a natural consequence of the modern feminist movement and an ideology that worships equality and equity. We're now at a point where activists who supposedly fight for equality view any difference, like if there's any difference in society, it must mean there's discrimination, which is not true. There's differences in nature. You're not going to get to a point where everyone's exactly the same in ability and thoughts, but that's what they want. They claim to want diversity, but they attack people for a difference of opinion.
Single one of them has stood up for women and girls. This is coming from people who claim to be feminists and we support women and all this other crap. They are terrified because they see what happens to people like me, and they care more about what their friends think of them and what those little circles of backslapping that take place in Washington, D.C., than they do about truth and common sense and actually caring for our kids and caring for our young women and girls and caring for the people in our country. And that's, so yes, it's people who believe that they are, they know what's best for our country more than we do. So they try to take away our ability to make choices for ourselves because they don't want us to make wrong choices. They try to control what information we see and don't see, because they know what's best for us, that they need to curate that so that we're protected from violent speech or hate speech or misinformation or disinformation, all of these things that they label to try to silence certain people's voices or certain narratives. They want to limit who we can vote for on the ballot. We saw over 32 states tried to take Trump off the ballot, so voters couldn't even have the right to choose. We talked about the legislation in California. It's not the
That's probably one of the worst things Democratic Party is doing. The last, Kamala didn't go through a primary. She was anointed. Joe Biden, I think, he had some opponents in the Democratic Party in 2020, but he was pushed through by the machine. And it's the Democratic Party has become among the most undemocratic organizations in the country. They hate democracy. They use it for their own agenda. They use the facade of a democracy, but behind the scenes, they are not democratic at all.
The only state that's pushing for this kind of thing. So we see them putting themselves in a position once again as the ultimate authority that can tell us what is true and what is false because they say it is so, that is more powerful and knows better than what our founders laid out for us in the Constitution. For example, Kamala Harris, there's Article 6 of the Constitution, talks about how there shall be no religious test for anyone serving in public office in our country. As a senator in the Judiciary Committee, she launched accusations against and opposed judicial nominees by President Trump simply because of their faith. This judge, Brian Boucher, for example, he was nominated not for the Supreme Court, it was some other federal circuit court judge, I believe, because he was Catholic and a member of the Knights of Columbus. Kamala Harris and our senator from Hawaii, Mazie Hirono, were launching accusations at him for his faith and asking him, will you give up your membership in the Knights of Columbus if you are allowed to serve as a judge? Completely defying the Constitution. I could go, there's too many examples, but ultimately what does it come down to? It comes down to power. They care more about power and whether it is those who know exactly what they are doing and the ends justify the means because they believe they alone know what is best for us, and they really do at their heart of hearts hate this country and what it stands for.
The ends do not justify the means. Anyone who says they do is a power-hungry tyrant. If you think the ends justify the means, you are no better than the average dictator, the average tyrant, the average terrorist. Every dictator in human history believe that the ends justify the means. We have to hold ourselves to a higher standard.
Or it's those who are sheep following along. The end result is the same. Mm-hmm. Both groups of these people are people who swore an oath to the Constitution like you and I did, and who are defying and breaking that promise in the oath that they swore and the promise that they made to those who voted for them to serve in office.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to jump around a little bit. I want to know how the lobbyists approach.
How they approach members of Congress?
How they approach members of Congress. How does that happen?
I just looked up on Grok, Elon Musk's AI. Biden administration targeting American Catholics. Yes, there's substantial evidence of improper FBI scrutiny and overreach targeting traditional Catholics during the Biden administration, though claims are of a broad prosecution campaign against all American Catholics require nuance. From the House judiciary.house.gov. core incident, the FBI Richmond memo. In January 2023, the FBI's Richmond Field Office produced an internal memo titled Interest of Racially or Ethnically Motivated Violent Extremists in Radical Traditionalist Catholic Ideology almost certainly presents new mitigation opportunities. It highlighted potential overlap between radical traditionalist Catholics, or RTCs, characterized by rejection of Vatican II, preference for the traditional Latin Mass, the TLM, and alleged anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant, or white supremacist ties, and domestic violent extremists. It suggested developing sources, informants within parishes offering the TLM and online Catholic communities for threat mitigation. The memo was distributed to over 1,000 FBI employees across field offices. I've never encountered any case of white supremacy, white nationalism, racist rhetoric in my Catholic community. I think that was probably just an excuse to surveil American Catholics, because the Biden administration was infected with this secular neoliberal ideology that hates traditional religion. It relied heavily on the Southern Policy Law Center, the SPLC, a left-leaning group criticized for labeling conservative religious organizations as hate groups. SPLC was recently found out as funding certain right-wing groups as controlled opposition for their own agenda. It's all a sham. FBI retracted it after it was leaked. In April 2024, DOJ Inspector General Review found it violated professional standards by conflating protected religious activity with extremism risks, but found no evidence of malicious intent or directed to target people solely for their faith. So it was all just an excuse to surveil American Catholics because the Biden administration was anti-religious. So that was that. Biden administration unfairly targeted American Catholics.
It is a very cozy relationship. You make friends. You run in the same social circles. There are lobbyists. There are retreats.
She's talking about relationships between elected officials and lobbyists.
That either members of Congress or political parties host, and lobbyists are very much a part of that. I'm sure that in some cases I know for sure in some cases they make direct threats that if you vote a certain way, there was someone I knew in Congress that was going to run an ad in their political campaign that was calling for negotiating lower prescription drug prices for Medicare to help seniors who couldn't afford it, and a couple other, again, common sense reforms that would actually help people and perhaps I wouldn't even say hurt big pharma because they make so much money, but it might reduce a little bit of the profits that they make. And the industry and the lobbyists for the industry said, if you run that ad, we're going to pull the however $5-10 million that we had set aside to run ads supporting your candidacy. They pulled the ad. And so you have the direct threat approach of pulling back of monetary support, and then you just have lobbyists who build up that friendship, and obviously they're funding these people's campaigns, and just be like, hey, bro, here's what I need you to do. This is what my boss is asking for. This is why it's important. I know this probably isn't a big issue for your district, so this is an easy one. Why don't you just vote this way?
So she was just explaining two ways that lobbyists put pressure on elected officials. The first way was the more direct way. It was basically strong arm. Hey, if you don't do this for us, we'll pull all your campaign funding. And a lot of elected officials are addicted to donations, addicted to funding, that they just kowtow to lobbyists. The second way, I think, is much more insidious. When elected officials and lobbyists develop friendships with each other to the point where they're willing to compromise for each other a little more because they've both been in those positions for years. Politician, the elected official keeps getting reelected, and the lobbyist had that job alongside him for years, and that relates to what's called the banality of evil, which is a philosophical idea from Hannah Arendt that posits that evil never appears, basically mask off. Evil appears in the small decisions that we make every day, and it compounds with every compromise. Every time you compromise your principles, that's an act of evil, or arguably, according to the philosophy of the banality of evil. I looked into his website, philosophybreak.com. Hannah Arendt on standing up to the banality of evil. For 20th century German philosopher Hannah Arendt, most evil is committed by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. Published July 2024. Where does evil come from? An evil act always committed by evil people, whose responsibility is it to identify and stamp out evil. These questions concern 20th century philosopher Hannah Arendt throughout her life and work, and in her final and unfinished 77 book, The Life of the Mind, she seems to offer a conclusion, writing, "The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil." Arendt was a German philosopher and political theorist who saw the techniques and evil consequences of totalitarian regimes firsthand. Born into a secular Jewish family, Arendt fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s, eventually settling in New York, where after the war she covered the trial of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. In her report for The New Yorker, later published in the 1963 book Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, Arendt expressed how disturbed she was by Eichmann, but for reasons that might not be expected. From the monster she thought he'd be, Eichmann was instead a rather bland, terrifyingly normal bureaucrat. He carried out his murderous role with calm efficiency, not due to an abhorrent, warped mindset, but because of a curious, quiet, authentic inability to think. His actions, Arendt wrote, could not be traced to any particularity of wickedness, pathology, or ideological conviction in the doer, whose only personal distinction was a perhaps extraordinary shallowness. Meaning, this guy, he wasn't Eichmann, he wasn't evil in a stereotypical way. He was just, as many people would say, following orders. That's the most insidious way we can succumb to the banality of evil, when we say we're just following orders. No, you have a duty to stand up to evil wherever it appears. And following orders is not just is not an excuse. But that's the banality of evil. Let's continue.
Yeah. What about, is there any direct money?
I'm excited to introduce to you the new...
We got an ad. Let's skip a little bit. Because these guys aren't paying me.
in use.
You see all these people, show up in Congress, the Senate, the cabinet, whatever, and, not wealthy.
Yeah.
And then, let's fast forward a couple years and they got Steve Aoki DJing their 40th birthday party. How does that happen?
I don't have firsthand experience in this. I have often questioned the same thing. I know a big factor is the insider trading that goes on in Congress. And again, some people will say, well, like, hey, I didn't know anything about this. I'm just making investments for my family, or my wife or my husband is making investments. I don't know anything about what's going on. Maybe they're being honest, maybe they're not. But the reality is you're in a position where you're making decisions either in committee or on the House floor that influence our markets, that influence the outcomes of certain industries, either causing some to tank or others to skyrocket. And the mere perception of insider trading shouldn't exist. This is legislation, again, I introduced in Congress years ago. No member of Congress should be allowed to do any trading of any stocks. Neither should their spouse, neither should their senior staff, period. These are the people who have access to proprietary private information that's not open to everybody in the public, or certainly before it becomes public. And the possibility of the abuse of power in trading on that information should not exist.
No matter where you're watching the Shawn Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this at all, anything, please like, comment, and subscribe. And most
that was Tulsi Gabbard on Shawn Ryan Show. That was not the full interview. This was a clip. But here's another thing on the banality of evil. This is the BritishAcademy.ac.uk. Hannah Arendt's Lessons for Our Times, the Banality of Evil, Totalitarianism, and Statelessness, August 23rd, 2024. If you spend any time on the internet, you'll no doubt be aware of Hannah Arendt's famous image, that young, sad woman's cigarette in her hands, staring into the mid-distance. You'll no doubt be aware too of her quotations that seem to drop into social media every time we hear another political outrage. There are no dangerous thoughts, Hannah Arendt says. Thinking itself is dangerous. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule, she also says, is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but the people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer holds. The practice of violence changes the world, she also says, but the more likely change is into a more violent world. If you remember the 60s, you'll also remember Hannah Arendt for her famous phrase, the banality of evil. But who was this beautiful woman who had the ability to drop the perfect words into the right political context at any given time? Hannah Arendt was born in Hanover, Germany in 1906 to progressive Jewish parents. She was reading Kant by the age 15. Oh wow, I've tried reading Kant. It's a tough read. Those German philosophers are no joke. At university, she met the philosopher Martin Heidegger. This was good news because he gave her the philosophical tools she needed to later develop her political thought. It was bad news because he became a Nazi. In 1933, she fled Berlin, having been captured by the Gestapo and spending the night in the cells. She fled to Paris, where she worked with refugee children. At the beginning of the war, she was sent into an internment camp, which she escaped in 1941. From there, she went to New York, where she lived the rest of her life into 1975 and became one of America's most prominent and controversial intellectuals. She died in 1975. She spoke her mind and she loved her world, and she never stopped fighting against totalitarianism. So what has she got to teach us today? I'm going to give you 3 quick dives into the key concepts. Banality of evil. She coined it when she attended the trial of the Nazi Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961. I think it's awesome. He was tried in Jerusalem. Arendt was one of the first to discover what was happening in the camps, the first to study the new system of the corpse factories, as she called them. When she watched the Nuremberg trials in the 1940s, she was aghast. She thought the Nazis had, she said, exploded the limits of law. We're never going to be able to put this genie back in the bottle, she thought. This changed when she went to Jerusalem in 1961 to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann for the New Yorker. Eichmann had always, in some ways, been in Arendt's life. They were born only 7 months apart. She said she'd never forgive herself unless she went to look at this walking disaster face to face, and so she went. That's a part of facing your accuser, well, it's kind of it's a flip of facing your accuser. In this case, she's facing her prosecutor, her persecutor. But what she found was not a figure of radical, awful evil, but a small, rather pompous man talking in cliches, self-importance, and radically unable to think about where he was or what he was talking about. Eichmann was banal. This didn't mean he was not evil. He was definitely evil, but the evil he represented is going to be far more difficult to counter. Eichmann was thoughtless. He was the kind of guy who sat next to you at a wedding and talked to you, looked through you, unaware that you were there. Eichmann couldn't grasp the world that was full of plural different people, so he eliminated a section of it. This evil, Arendt said, this thoughtless evil had gotten to our culture and was spreading like fungus. So basically, you need to know how to think, and to be able to think, you need to read as much as you can and write down your thoughts to organize them. Don't just follow orders for the sake of following orders. Question people who are in positions of authority above you. That's the most important thing. You need to question people who are in positions of authority above you. Don't just say, oh, he's writing me a paycheck, so he owns me. No, you're still your own person. You still have agency. If anything, it's more important for us to question our bosses, our superiors. Let's see what's the British Academy have to say.
My name is Lindsay Stonebridge. I'm Professor of Humanities and Human Rights at the University of Birmingham, and I want to talk to you about Hannah Arendt. If you spend any time on the internet, you'll no doubt be aware of...
It's just a video of what I just... Well, that's all I wanted to cover here. What do you think about Tulsi Gabbard, Shawn Ryan, the banality of evil? What do you think about the banality of evil in terms of our own governments, our elected officials, the parties, Republicans, Democrats? Do you hate Tulsi Gabbard? Do you hate her guts? Did you disagree with everything she said here? Let's continue the conversation in the comments.